Speaking of resources of a different kind, there's a few different books that I would recommend just to help you further think through like the concept of the life mission or the job mission, helping assess in terms of what makes you happy, how to more authentically identify with that, especially in a professional setting. And some of the other books that are just really great in terms of thinking through what's going on in our brains and how we show up in our personal professional lives. So I definitely recommend, if you're a book person, these are some of my favorites. And then we've covered a few different supportive topics to this area that are recorded webinars. So depending on what interests you, we have a Ask Me Anything Career Edition, which it gets into some specifics about concepts we talked about today. We have the Burnt Out webinar, which part of this webinar is building off of that in terms of we are all in this state of burnout, which is why we need to do some degrowth. But the Burnout webinar is there in case you need to dig back into like the science of that and what's happening. We have the Hello Imposter webinar, which amazingly contributes to burnout and how we show up in our work life. So it could be a helpful one to go through. Project management, which we could all use more of in the museum and archives field. So if project management and those concepts are newer for you, it's a good webinar to check out. As we think about things that are valuable, like what work we do that has value and us as collection workers and the value of our job, strategies for how to capture and communicate the value of collection work is a good webinar for you. That will help you identify some specifics in terms of the high impact activities we spoke of, and then the less quantitative and more qualitative aspects of our work and how to capture those. And then finally, the what do we value and how do we measure it? So getting into the details of it more in terms of what do we do in our daily work? How can we help to quantify that? Or perhaps better terms, what are the metrics for success in those specific areas? So of all of these, I recommend those last two, especially if you are having a challenge identifying what work is essential, what work has value, and how to communicate that as well to people who are not you, whether that is communicating up to your boss or externally to whichever party. Questions. We've got a couple specific questions before the webinar recording, so we'll include those now. Now is a good time for you to put questions into the chat box if you haven't already, because as we go through the questions, we'll then end the webinar just so that we can hopefully keep it under the hour mark for you and respect your time. So first question, what is the best way to handle burnout that results from group work? I sometimes feel like I'm back in high school carrying a project for my entire group and then feeling frustrated and angry when my entire group receives praise for the work that I did alone. So my first question is, can we say no? Can we not? So to some degree asking you, is the group work assigned or is it somewhat voluntary? Because in which case, if it is somewhat voluntary, let's just stop doing it for a while, especially if the people who tend to end up in your type of group work are really just not pulling their weight. This kind of reminds me of my committee work in terms of, you're there to spend some of your finite resources, but not everybody is making that same commitment, in which case it's not a healthy environment to be in. If it's not up to you in terms of whether or not you participate in the group work, then trying a reframing of it and being very clear about what your role and contribution is. So for your particular question, I don't know the details, but if I'm to assume that some of this group work is happening like within your museum, then I would make sure that you're very clear when you talk about the work, whether that is informally with your boss or whether that is in context with your group, being very clear about what responsibilities of that group work were ones that you led or that you took on. And I would even engage with, when you're with that group, having a discussion about which parts are whose responsibility. because ultimately, when it's a group setting, I find if there's not a specific name against a particular item, then that is the grayness and the fuzziness that allows people to make the benign or malicious assumption that just somebody else is going to take care of it. Especially if you've established a reputation of being the person who takes care of it, then unfortunately they have learned that they don't need to be the ones to take that on. So, a couple different strategies here in terms of to what extent do you have agency of being in these groups. And then, if you do need to be in these groups, having some very specific and clear boundaries about what is just your responsibility and what is somebody else's responsibility to take on. When decisions have to be made in a group setting, I recommend doing it as a live meeting where everybody brings their pieces they're responsible for. The group makes decisions and then they go back and they do the things that they're responsible for. So keeping it very specific to, yes, we may be working as a group, but each person has their own thing they're responsible for, and I'm only going to be responsible for the things I need to be responsible for. And just being really clear and communicative in terms of what are the things that you are working on, especially with your boss or whomever it is that needs to know that. So I wish there was an easier answer in terms of like, just don't do group work. Of course, if it's up to you, then yeah, make that decision. Don't do group work. But if it's not up to you, then trying to make it as tolerable and as specific and with boundaries as possible. Next question. How can I learn to accept idiosyncratic workflows within a museum library that largely ignores or takes for granted the expertise of archivists? Our archives and special collections team plays a very minor role in our digitization program, despite the fact that much of what gets digitized comes from our collections. It is very frustrating. So yeah, first of all, really hear and feel you on the unfortunate reality of larger institutions that even though they're institutions built on specific areas of expertise, they seem to be the worst at acknowledging all of those areas of expertise, usually librarians and archivists. It is also extremely weird, but not uncommon that a totally different department is digitizing what is ultimately a majority of your collection stuff. So, are there some wins we can make with compromise? So, thinking about the second, more specific part first, when we're talking about who's digitizing what, um, who's making those decisions, are there some conversations we can have with whatever that other department or person is that can be helpful to both sides in terms of maybe they still do the digitizing, but can you inform what the priorities are or provide them information on, look, these are our most in demand things. It makes sense work wise for us to digitize these, and also for our community because these are the most requested items. So I think having a conversation or series of conversations at that level, perhaps framed under the guise of how can we better support your work. And of course, there's the reverse where how can you better support our work in that type of framing. So approaching it from a curiosity perspective, but with an aim to hopefully have you both feel happy about what's happening and who's doing what. Um, Also thinking about the digitizing is happening somewhere else, that can be incredibly frustrating. But if we cannot get anywhere in a constructive manner, is there a possibility for like a bless and release? Like of all of the things on your plate or the different concerns or different critical items that are for you to deal with, is this particular area one that's critical currently? If it's not, and again, this specific to the digitizing, we'll get to the first part in a minute, then maybe it's not something you worry about for the moment. Like, yes, still very frustrating in terms of how this has been set up at your organization. But depending on its ultimate impact on you and your staff, et cetera, maybe it's something, that, a fight for a different day or what have you. Coming back up to this first part, which of course, like is fundamentally harder because we are talking about these persons, or people are either ignorant in the sense of they are just not aware of what it is that you do, which seems silly, but maybe it's benign, maybe it's not malicious. Or the second one where it is malicious, where they do conceptually know what you do, but they just don't value it. So in the first case, you can apply some gentle education and some gentle outreach in terms of the specifics of what you do, the value of what you bring, as the work professional, as well as the collection work itself. If it's the second one, then you're up against trying to change a person's mind, um, which is very hard to do, especially for adults. Our brains are just not as flexible anymore, and so that ultimately gets to, like, yes, you can still try gentle education to like bring them around, but for me it becomes more a game of containment and minimizing damage. So to what extent can we restrict the damage of this person and their beliefs, and instead do some other things over here to counteract? So for example, um, the largely ignores or takes for granted the expertise of archivists. So for me, like if it's the director that is doing that and has the malicious opinion, so it's not just the ignorance part, I would go and get allies from everywhere else. And I would preach the value and do gentle education and outreach everywhere else, not with this director, to sort of counteract whatever effect they're having. So, for example, if there's a celebration event coming up, your particular department does not have a seat at the table, even though it obviously should. Having allies in other areas that do get invited to that meeting with that executive director can help make sure that you are brought up in that conversation and ultimately included in the aspects they have control over. So it's not an easy answer, but if anybody does have an easy answer, by all means write a book. You could make a lot of money. But ultimately it's assessing what is it in terms of, do they not know, or do they not care, or bit of both, and then what else can we do to counteract that? And ultimately, again, sort of coming back to the Marie Kondo, like, you have many other things, I'm sure, in addition to this. So weighing it against those other areas and deciding, is this a fight you fight today? Or is it something that you save for later? Or maybe the fight, aka advocacy, looks a little different in a different place. So hopefully that is helpful. It is a messy situation, and I'm really sorry that you are in it. Both of those aspects are incredibly frustrating. And I'm very sorry that you're in that position.